On June 5th, we encountered a snowstorm between the Hart River and O'Fallon Creek amid freezing temperatures. Roy mentioned the wagon train halted at Powder River and did not proceed to Rosebud before circling back to Powder. We noticed Indian graves in a valley between Miles City and Rosebud. Near Fort Keogh is where Reno returned from his scouting expedition. Between this location and the Rosebud River, we encountered lowlands dotted with Indian graves nestled among the trees. Some of the soldiers from G Troop vandalized these graves, looted them, and discarded the remains into the Yellowstone River. McIntosh was informed by several individuals that G Troop might face consequences for these actions. Along the trail alongside the Rosebud River, we observed Indian ponies grazing on grass from both sides for extensive stretches. According to Roy, on June 22nd, we departed from a campsite located in the woods about a mile east of the mouth of the Rosebud River. We traversed a hill and reached the Rosebud at a point some distance away from the river itself. After crossing it, we continued our journey up the western side of the river. His description suggests that Custer followed a path that is now marked by the current road. Roy also mentioned that it was widely believed that Bob Jackson and Billy Cross never crossed at Fort A. Nobody recalls seeing them during the skirmish in the valley or on the west side of the river at any point. There was a patch of timber about 50 yards from the western bank of Fort A. Reno's advance consisted of companies G, A, and M in that sequence. After crossing the ford, we formed a line. While we were getting into position, I overheard some of the men saying, "There goes Custer." We could see him on the hills to our right and across the river. We dismounted about 200 yards ahead of the timber, and the skirmish line moved forward to the edge of the woods. Company G was on the right, followed by Company A, and then Company M on the left. There wasn't any timber to the right of our line, according to Roy. A group of Indians hid in the woods ahead of the skirmish line on the right side, shooting diagonally towards the southwest. The skirmish line extended west from the edge of the woods, not where it's marked on the map. Roy witnessed Charlie Reynolds dismounted and injured, with a pistol in hand, attempting to follow the retreating troops. Roy described, "Once my horse was injured, he appeared to lose control and I couldn't manage him. But he went to the right, and I stuck with him, and he got us through all right." We were called back from the skirmish line and entered the woods about 50 yards to retrieve my horse. I encountered Wallace too on horseback, leading G Troop out. I inquired, to no one in particular, about the whereabouts of my horse, and Wallace responded, "Grab any horse you can find and get out of here." He mentioned that everyone left from the southern side of the woods. I estimate I was on the skirmish line for a solid 20 minutes. I fired about 20 rounds of ammunition. I observed ravines towards the hillside filled with Indians shooting diagonally towards our line. Additionally, I spotted Indians on the opposite side of the river from the woods, maneuvering around towards the east. I saw them moving through the woods. As I went into the woods, I spotted Gilbert 3 emerging with 4 horses, one of which was mine. I quickly mounted up and joined the column, shouting to Gilbert to follow and hurry. I trailed behind Gilbert and was slow in exiting the woods. About 75 or 100 yards from the timber, I saw Charlie Reynolds on foot, wounded and armed with a pistol, standing his ground. Shortly after, my horse was shot through the jaws just behind the mouth. The horse stumbled but quickly regained its footing, allowing me to mount. When the horse fell, my sling belt flew over my head, causing me to lose my carbine. As I mounted, I only had my pistol. We made it safely to the river, with the water reaching about belly deep to the horse. We immediately began climbing the bluff. My horse was bleeding heavily, so I left him behind as we ascended the bluff. There was talk that Reno would join Custer, and I informed Captain Moylan that I was dismounted. He replied, "Well, find one." And I was extremely eager to do so because it would have been very risky to be without a horse if the unit had left the area. About 10 minutes after reaching the top of the bluff, Benteen arrived, and there was discussion about going to Custer. I then spoke with Moylan about acquiring a horse. Afterwards, I descended about halfway down to the river and retrieved my horse. Shortly after Benteen arrived, Weir went out and later returned with Sioux in pursuit. There was intense gunfire until nightfall. King was wounded on the evening of the 25th. On the evening of the 25th, we constructed breastworks. After the shooting stopped, Reno approached Moylan and said, Get one non-commissioned officer to lead 6 volunteers out to stand guard in front of Company A's line. Moylan asked one non-commissioned officer after another to volunteer for this task. Hayne got wounded. Sergeant Feeler was asked but declined to volunteer. Sergeant McDermott was willing to go, but Moylan preferred him to remain as first sergeant instead of being replaced by Sergeant Easley. Sergeant Easley explained he had been on guard duty the previous night. Then Moylan asked me, and I agreed to go if men would join me. Afterwards, the privates were summoned, and the following individuals volunteered: Connor, Gilbert, Bancroft, McClurg, and Harris. Another individual, whose name I won't mention, initially volunteered, but backed out at the last minute before we set off. I then offered to stand guard with one of the men during one shift. After the volunteers stepped forward, I sought orders from Reno. He instructed me to have the men sneak out one at a time, as the Sioux were still active in the vicinity, galloping around, a sound we could clearly hear. Reno emphasized the importance of 2 men staying awake at all times and conversing to ensure they remained alert. We were all exhausted and desperately needed sleep. Additionally, Reno advised that if the Indians initiated gunfire early the next morning, we should disperse and make for the breastworks individually rather than grouping together. The picket duty proceeded exactly as directed by my detail, and at dawn, when the Sioux opened fire, we were lying low in the grass and sagebrush. We retreated to our line safely and in an orderly fashion. My captain commended me for my performance that night. The fighting commenced at daybreak on June 26th and intensified greatly until around 10 a.m. We observed the Sioux riding around us in large numbers, resembling racehorses. They unleashed such a barrage of gunfire that it mowed down all the sagebrush in front of us. A brief rain shower occurred around noon on the 26th, and although the men held their ponchos to catch some of it, they didn't catch much. In the morning of June 26, F.C. Mann, a civilian packer, was fatally shot. He was stationed behind a breastwork along a company's line holding a carbine. Positioned behind a breastwork approximately 3 feet high, Mann was seen aiming his carbine for about 20 minutes. Someone remarked that something seemed amiss with Mann. Upon closer inspection, he was discovered to be dead, struck in the temple and killed instantly. Mann had remained in position, sighting his gun without any movement. Around 11 a.m. on June 26th, we hauled up additional dead horses and lengthened our defensive line towards Benteen's location, providing better cover for the men. In my view, Benteen rescued the unit. He displayed remarkable bravery and nerve. As we became thirsty, we resorted to chewing grass to moisten our mouths. Unfortunately, Cowley 5 went mad from dehydration and took some time to recover. We had to restrain him securely on June 26th. Following Benteen's advance, the demand for water grew urgent, particularly among the wounded. Some enlisted men suggested that volunteers should make their way to the river to fetch water. This idea circulated, and eventually, the officers allowed any willing men to step forward. Shortly thereafter, 19 men volunteered, but the officers deemed this number excessive and decided that only 12 could go. It was agreed that each man would carry 2 canteens, and the party would also bring along about 6 2-gallon camp kettles. Sergeant Feeler, along with 4 others, served as sharpshooters, securing the timber on the west bank and preventing the Indians from taking cover there. However, many Indians lurked along the riverbank, ready to shoot at anyone attempting to fetch water. As we descended from the top of the bluff, we had to sprint across an open area about 100 yards wide to reach the head of the ravine. From there to the river, we remained hidden from the Sioux. Arriving at the mouth of the ravine, we observed Indians concealed in the brush on the opposite bank of the river. However, we refrained from firing to avoid initiating a confrontation. The ravine was approximately 20 yards from the water. Madden was the 3rd man to dash for water and was struck, breaking his leg. Despite his injury, he managed to crawl back to cover unaided. Being a large, heavy man, his wound caused him great agony, and he requested to remain there undisturbed, believing it to be safe. He was eventually carried up before nightfall. The water party consisted of Roy, Gilbert, Madden from K Troop, Wilbur from M Troop, Bancroft, Harris, Voigt, Peter Thompson, Golden, Tanner, Coleman from B Troop, and Boreen. Roy expressed uncertainty about the last 3 names. I was the 5th man to rush for water. While in the ravine, we organized ourselves and agreed that each man could choose whether to go or not when his name was called. The first man, whose name I can't recall, returned with a kettle full of water, and we all took a drink, our first in 36 hours. I believe Wilbur was fourth, and he was wounded. After Madden got hit, he crawled back, and we provided him with water and tended to his wounds. Then, there was a pause of about half an hour before anyone else went. Overall, we spent about an hour in the ravine fetching water. We would rush to fill the kettle from the river and then use the kettles to fill our canteens. About an hour and a half later, we returned to the hilltop with the water, and Lieutenant Charles Varnum was assigned to guard it. Dr. Henry R. Porter distributed water to the wounded, but there wasn't sufficient supply to satisfy all their needs. The battle persisted, and as evening approached, the Indians eased their gunfire and retreated. That night, we dug pits towards the river to protect the water route and brought up an ample supply of water for the men's use. That night, Fred Gerard, Bill Jackson, Lieutenant Charles DeRudio, and Tom O'Neill returned. I heard DeRudio shout hello, and George Bott, a guard from A Troop, challenged him. DeRudio responded with Lieutenant DeRudio, and upon receiving orders to advance, he entered the camp. There was immense relief and joy as we had feared they were killed. Although we observed Indians leaving the valley on the evening of June 26th, we were skeptical and thought it might be a trick. On the morning of June 27th, we led the horses down to water. It was heart-wrenching to witness the poor animals submerge their heads in the water up to their eyes to drink. The 7th Infantry arrived and set up camp in the valley near where McIntosh was killed. The officers from Gibbon's command generously gave up all their sugar, lemons, and other comforts for our wounded. On the 28th, I was assigned to assist in euthanizing around 20 injured horses scattered along the bluff sides. These were horses left behind during the retreat up the bluffs on June 25th. In the morning of June 28th, we went to the Custer battlefield to bury the dead. We transported our wounded to the camp in the village opposite the Custer battlefield. Some were able to ride horses, but about 30 had to be carried by hand on blankets. We took turns carrying them, and the infantry provided assistance. Afterwards, we formed a skirmish line and buried the deceased. On the way, we followed what we believed to be Custer's trail, and at one point, it led us quite close to the river. The first deceased person we encountered was Corporal John Foley. I overheard several individuals remark, "There lies Foley of C Company." When I saw him, I immediately recognized him because of his bald head and black hair. He appeared to be of middle age, and I was familiar with him. Foley was positioned at least 3/4 of a mile ahead of the initial cluster of deceased at C. The next body we encountered belonged to Sergeant Butler, and the distance from him to the first cluster of dead at C was quite significant. He lay approximately halfway between Foley and C. There were no deceased horses nearby Foley or Butler. I assisted in burying the bodies on the western slope of the ridge, and we concluded with E Troop men near the gully. Afterwards, I became nauseous from the odor and went to the river to drink some water. Stanislas Roy, a native of France, served as a sergeant in Company A of the 7th Cavalry. He initially enlisted in the 7th Cavalry in 1869 and re-enlisted on January 19, 1875, at the age of 28 in Cincinnati, Ohio. On October 5, 1878, he received the Medal of Honor with the citation, "Brought water to the wounded under heavy enemy fire, risking his life." He was involved in the Nez Perce campaign and the battle at Bear Paw Mountain from October 2 to 4, 1877. He passed away at Columbus Barracks, Ohio, on February 10, 1913.